down under. And you might have seen the comments that all the globes are upside down. What's going on? So Keith Nesbitt, he has a background in computer science and mathematics, and he's joining us right now. But he's also having 12 painting exhibitions to his credit, as well as collaborations with various musicians that have produced 5 CDs. What about that? We might actually get more music this way here. We also know that Keith got his bachelor's degree from Newcastle University and his master's in computing from Newcastle. Between 1989 and 1999, he worked on applied computer research for BHP Research, investigating business applications of virtual reality and intelligent agents. His PhD examines the design of immersive multisensory information displays, and it was completed eventually with Peter Eads at Sydney University. And Peter Eads was the one who I think had a hard time understanding what exactly that PhD was about. And this is something very common in academic environments, that it's PhD students are creative. They're supposed to be creative and innovative. And now they have something that they deeply care about, but they can't really communicate to their advisors. And so from what I hear, or maybe I'm just making this up, and so Keith has all abilities to argue against this, I think he actually kind of a little bit gave up, went to the nearby big city and saw a subway map. And he's like, oh my God, I can explain all these different trains of thoughts that goes through my PhD thesis by creating a subway map that helps me explain to my advisor how this all interrelates and interlinks. And then he has this beautiful animation of a base map, basically, of the subway system, but then different subways have different colors, but also different names, and they represent different lines of thought. And there's a beautiful watercolor drawing also that goes with all of this. And that's how we connected. That's when I thought, oh my God, this is really cool. And it might help many other PhD students get a PhD ultimately, because now they have a way to communicate to their advisors how this could potentially be experienced and explained, of how these different lines of research go together. So Keith, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here joining us from, I think, almost diagonally opposing points. Well, not quite, right? So if you go through,
yes,
I guess I should just get a globe and look at it, and Ingo would know, and I'm just, I'd have to cut this out later on. But where are we if we go from your current point of view? Where do we end up? Do you know? Ingo might know. Sorry, Ingo, for putting you on the spot. I can take this beautiful, beautiful Italian globe.
You mean if you drill?
If you drill a hole.
If Keith would drill,
well, it's right.
Where would it come out?
Yeah, it's kind of,
yeah.
It's there.
Mid-Atlantic.
It's not gonna happen. All right, but we made it down under. This is the world as Keith lives it. This is the correct orientation of the planet, of our Earth. And Keith, please do take us away.
Okay, thank you very much. And I can confirm, in fact, that my supervisor at the end of my PhD was most confused about all the kind of ideas coming together and wondering how they did fit. The truth is, though, that one of his favorite visualizations, one of Peter's favorite visualizations, as it is of many, is the London Metro map, which has such a long history as well. And I thought, as a treat for Peter, I would take his criticism to heart and build for him a metro map which would navigate through the complex lines of thought, I guess, through my thesis. And I'm hoping today, this afternoon, I'm going to go back and revisit that, because one of the great things about maps is, of course, when you're trying to navigate a complex space, and if you haven't been to those locations for a while, then it's always nice to have a map and being able to navigate through the thing. So I'm going to try, if people don't mind, and I know it's kind of late over there, even though it's Sunday afternoon here in Australia, and I'm due for a beer, just as you guys probably due for a wine on a Saturday evening. But I'm going to go back to that map, and I'm just going to run through the tracks for you and hopefully show you how all the interconnecting bits of thought hang together in my thesis. And I guess unlike some of the other maps, which are more macroscope, this is more a microscope into my PhD thesis and all the ideas that I was trying to bring together when I was doing that piece of work. Unfortunately, probably the map is more remembered or more famous than the PhD itself. But, so what I'll do is, please interrupt if, yes, Charles Beck, indeed. And there's quite a lot of famous story about the abstraction process that went on to build the London Metro map. I'm going to try and share my screen. Is that working? Oops, no, I've got it selected. I'll share. Hopefully you're seeing this. And I must admit, I went through these slides yesterday, but it's been quite a while since I visited this talk from 2000, so 20 years. So it's nice to go back and see if any of this is still relevant. Some of the terminology might have changed. I have put down the bottom the link to Sydney University where you can download the thesis if you're more interested in the detail of things, which people may be. So here is the map as it appears in the Atlas of Science, and it looks quite complicated. What you'll see, there's 10 main tracks of things, and some of these are domains of science, others are to do with outcomes from my thesis, and others are to do with some of the underlying main currents which motivated my PhD. And I'm going to run through this map, and I'm going to go quickly at times. I'm going to actually jump stations because some of the stations live on multiple tracks, and this is where kind of ideas cross over. So don't be dismayed if I miss a station and come back to it later. So the motivation for my thesis all began with this desire to look at abstract data. There was this, at the time, 2000, this huge explosion in data, and the future looked like there was going to be more and more data coming about. Lots of large data sets, lots of attributes in the data. So not just a single attribute, but many in a data set. And the intention might be to, I'm having trouble with this Zoom seeing some of my, which station I'm on. Many applications where we're interested in lots of large data. And I think this is not lessened over time. In fact, many people struggle with these problems today. Oops, today's. And something we might be interested in is exploring these data to find new patterns that are useful patterns that we might leverage off. The thing that I was interested in my thesis was really building these things I call human perceptual tools. So really about expanding into multi-sensory information display. And I won't talk too much about virtual abstract worlds or virtual hybrid worlds. I'll come back to those stations in a little while. And I'll also talk later about a little bit about the stock market data, which was a case study that ran through my thesis. And I'll also come back to this track, which will talk about a process. I think with any software engineering type thing, anything you're building, there's always some process underlying thing to try and improve the quality. So let's go back. And talk about something that was very big at the time and still now, of course, even expanding as well, is this idea of data mining. We've got this data, we'd like to mine it to find useful patterns. I was more interested in patterns in abstract data rather than what you might call scientific data. So not scientific visualization, more abstract data visualization things. Of course, because visual data mining has been an idea that's been around for a long time, well, at least 100 years or so. So there's lots of examples of that. And the idea is that you could build some visual representation of your data, then look at it and hopefully uncover some rules or patterns or relationships in the data that surprised you and were useful for some reason. There's no reason why we can't talk more about the other senses as well. And even though today still we kind of have this, seem to have a reliance on the visual information displays. To build these human perceptual tools really requires some technology to actually do this, especially when you start talking about multisensory displays of data. And at the time, I was very interested in virtual reality, which has been around, of course, since the late 1950s when people began to, this idea of this ultimate display was described. So Here we're back at virtual abstract worlds and virtual hybrid worlds. I'll talk more about those when I go onto the virtual reality track and discuss that. Again, stock market data was something I was interested in. In terms of data mining, I was working a lot with stock market traders. And of course, one of the things they're really interested in is finding trading patterns in stock market data. They want to get rich, apparently. So I'll again come back and explain the case study that ran through my PhD. And part of this process that I'll describe in terms of designing a multisensory display is to consider more closely the domain you're working in and what sort of tasks those experts in those domains might be doing, so that you're really not just finding patterns, but you're finding specific types of pattern in specific types of data. So that's 2 tracks gone, and this is one of the more interesting tracks, I guess, virtual environments, and still expanding technology. Even now, we're still coming to grips, I think, with the computing requirements to build great virtual environments, particularly to remove the kind of incumbents to immersion, which are just the technology itself being in the roads. You know, things like head-mounted displays are great, but you're still kind of aware that you're in those. In 2000, these were still a new interface technology. That's how I used to think about them, even though the idea for them had been around, as I said, for 50 years or so, or 45 so years. The good thing about virtual environments from my perspective were that they really supported this idea of naturally interacting with things, with data, and the idea that you wouldn't be outside a computer talking to the computer, but you'd actually be inside the data, inside the computer. I guess we call that immersion these days, immersed in your data. Truthfully, there are many types of interaction styles depending on the type of virtual environments, and that's something I guess is not a little bit confusing for people. There's not just one type of virtual environment. There's lots of different types of virtual environments, and they enhance they have different capabilities that can be enhanced in them. One of the motivations for the original description of this ultimate display, which Ivan Sutherland called his idea around this, was that you could somehow increase the bandwidth between the human and computer. And from my perspective, looking at data visualization or multisensory display, here was an opportunity, perhaps, with all this data to improve the bandwidth between our data and our perceptual and cognitive abilities to find these patterns in it. Virtual real, I tend to distinguish at the time. I don't know if this is a good breakdown or not, but in the history of science, I guess, tradition of science at least, we tend to want to break things down a bit. And I tend to distinguish virtual real worlds, which are worlds which are really built from our real world, if you like. So imagine virtual tourism, imagine going back in the past, even building ancient cities from data, and then being able to immerse yourself in that thing. That's what I would call a virtual real world. This is not what I was looking at for my in my PhD. The other, sorry, I have a bit of a lag on my pressing here. Okay, so virtual hybrid worlds is somewhere where I kind of distinguish that we use these 3D world objects, and human medical data is a great example because we have this 3D structure which we can overlay abstract data. If you look at geology, geography, these are other areas where you have in place already great 3D structure, and the globe is all those globes we looked at before is a perfect example of this, somehow being able to overlay that data with some spatial grid in mind. Virtual abstract worlds, on the other hand, if I get my, virtual abstract worlds, which was I was thinking about at the time, was you have no real 3D structure, no real structure at all to the data. It's all very abstract. I mean, what does stock market data look like, for example? Something we can do and is done a lot is we take some model we have in the real world. We're used to navigating perhaps around a city. So perhaps we could take those lessons we learned and then turn our data into things like that. So use these metaphors and build these abstract virtual worlds, which would help us navigate about our data. So that was the kind of, I guess, area that I was working on in my PhD. When you bring virtual environments, for me, they're the enabling technologies for building these human perceptual tools. Particularly, they enable a lot of multisensory things. They have some extra capabilities. over other things as well. So if you're talking information visualization, they do potentially enhance the visual sense by giving you this true stereo graphics in the thing. So you can really be in a 3D world, full 3D world. In terms of sound, they allow for spatial display of sound, whether it's through headphones, which gets very complicated, or through spatialized speaker arrays. You have this ability to do also sound display in these environments. And something that was just beginning to become practical at the time were the phantom force feedback device, which came out of MIT, allow you to do a little bit of haptic display. I must admit, we're still a long way away from having any really true touch, trying to get anywhere near a digital touch display. Hopefully soon, but it's been 20 years. There's not been huge leaps in those areas. But I wanted to explore that in my thesis, and I did. And part of that was through this phantom force feedback device. In my PhD, I've lost my slides again. All my windows are in the road. There we go. So I consider lots of VE platforms. I didn't want to just look at one. I had to consider a lot. And as part of the process of doing that, when you go to building these, any kind of display, one of the things I found anyway was that I was at some restriction around the software that I was using would often kind of make choices for me, if you like. I would want to do things which were easy to do in that software. And the same with the hardware. There were kind of limitations or potential good things about different sorts of hardware that I want to take advantage of. In the thesis, I had a number of case studies in lots of different types of virtual environments. One was a large screen, immersive circular screen, which lets you, again, stereographic display, lets you really be inside that world. The Barco Barron was something I had access to in Australia down at CSIRO, and it was more like a flat, large screen display. The responsive workbench I used was at GMD and just near Bonn in Germany. And it was much more like a tabletop display of data. Imagine interacting with your data over the top of a table. That's what this responsive workbench is like. And Haptic Workbench integrated this phantom force feedback device into a stereographic display. So you were kind of manipulating and feeling your data in a little cube. So about, the size of a large, about the size of one of those globes, Ingo's globes, about that size. You could actually touch and feel things, attributes of your data. So quite interesting and quite different from the other platforms. And the other platform I used was a wedge, which is a bit like a poor man's cave because it only has 2 walls. But again, it creates this kind of space and allows you to lay the data around you and actually be immersed inside the data, which is an interesting thing. So that's the virtual environment track, and still these days very interesting. Typically here, I think I used to show a video. I won't do that. I'll move on because we want to move to the next track, which seems to be an obvious track. But when we start talking all these things, one area which really becomes important is the domain of human perception. I'm not even going to talk too much about cognition, but that's also important. For me, sorry, I'm just moving my little things around so I can see what's going on. So, of course, I'm working in perceptual data mining, so naturally I should be thinking about perception, of course. I want to build human perceptual tools, so I want to do data mining in these virtual environments. I think, to understand better what's going on in human perception, and it's very complex. And of course, there's a lot of work done in the domain of perceptual science, and I'm no expert in that domain, but I try to understand enough of different parts of that to help in the design process. Even physiology comes into our perceptions, so that's another example of why things are so complex. Cognition tends to be separated from perception. There's links between those, and putting a dividing line between perception and cognition is quite tricky. But all I'm doing here is, I guess, demonstrating, for me at least, how complex it is to build. When we go to build a multi-sensory display, it's very complex, because the other thing you have to worry about is sensory bias. Some people, and most of us, I guess, do have this bias towards the visual sense, but some people may be biased towards other senses. And when you start putting data on multiple sensors, you've got to worry about sensory interaction, because, if you make a loud sound while you touch something, it will actually feel harder than if you make a soft thudding sound. So, much like with ventriloquism, one sense can override the other and interact in ways that can be quite unexpected and difficult to plan for. What has also happened, and I don't know if this is still true, I know there's people who are probably more in the domain of perceptual science, but I certainly, when I was looking at this, found that we have this real division between vision, hearing, and haptics. You've got people who are experts in vision perception, and people who are experts in haptic perception, and then people who are experts in hearing perception. So not really that many people working on bringing those things together. And the same thing kind of happened in the domain, which I guess I was part of, which was looking at the science of information display. We seem to have this separation into information visualization, information sonification or audification, and then people doing, and not that many people, but a few people doing information using haptics. So this breakdown was kind of working against what I wanted to do in my thesis, which was to bring these senses together and think about perceptual information displays and how to map abstract data to different senses. One of the nice things about all these people doing all this work in these other areas, though, is that I could gather guidelines, some simple guidelines from human perception, and bring them. And this is the MS guidelines is one of those outcomes in my thesis, which was just gathering together in a structured way guidelines from different disciplines which are of interest or import for the design of multisensory displays. Oh, I feel like I'm going fast. Let's talk about information display. And I think I've already mentioned that. If you look in the domain of people doing visualization or generally interested in data mining visually, you do get this kind of pretty strict breakdown, in the past at least, to people doing visual displays, people doing auditory displays, and people doing touch displays. And of course, lots of people doing visual, quite a few people doing auditory. There was usually a specialized group of people, usually musicians or people seem to have a bias towards sound, and then not that much going on in haptics, even in 2000, of course, but even these days, there's still that kind of mismatch. And the difficulty when you separate these things is it becomes very difficult to transfer knowledge between the different domains, different senses, and difficult to compare and contrast which sense might be best for looking at what sorts of pattern and what sorts of data. Let's talk a little bit about information displays. And I've already mentioned virtual abstract worlds, which is the kind of thing that I was interested in building. The problem with stock market data, as I mentioned, is what does it look like, especially if you want to do 3D? I mean, does it even make sense to do 3D data displays? That's probably still a bit of an open question somewhat, but at the time it certainly was. What would a 3D display of stock market data best look like? And certainly pattern, if you want to build it for data mining, as I've mentioned already, we're revisiting the same tracks already, which is great. We don't need to explain them too much, but again, we're doing data mining using human perception, these human perceptual tools. Of course, information visualization is of course, well known in all these Katie's books, and has been something that's happened quite a long time. In fact, abstract visualization is probably really became popular at the 1900s, the turn of the century. So it's not that long that we've really been doing a lot of abstract visualization of data, even though there are examples from prehistory and other cultures where of some of these things, but maps, for example, which show a bit of abstract data, but not that common. But there are lots of examples of visualization. I don't know if people here have worked in sonification or audification. It's an interesting area. Of course, the ears are very good at picking up certain sorts of patterns, especially temporal types of patterns. And haptics is a really unusual thing. We're still limited, as I mentioned, by the technology being able to really do good haptic display. Haptics tends to be about integrating spatial information over time. So we need good displays to do that. We're really still limited to these force feedback devices, which are just a point in space. So it's a very limited use of touch, but still, I think it's some promise there. One of the things we do with abstract data, and people have talked about metaphors before perhaps, is to try and take something from a domain we understand well and then use that to model our something in the data domain. So trees are a good example of this, of course, and graphs, I guess, the more formal definition of what we're talking about. You have leaves and you have branches, and we talk in terms of trees, which people seem to understand well. There's lots of examples of that when we, in visualization, where people take various metaphors. Something that I guess I came to the realization of myself when I was doing my thesis was, really, there's a different way to divide the design space. Instead of dividing this design space based on the senses, why not we think about it in terms of spatial metaphors, direct metaphors, and temporal metaphors. So spatial metaphors deal with the way we put information into space or interpret information spatially, and then that can happen across all the senses. Direct metaphors are more directly related to specific attributes of each sense. So color is a good example in terms of the visual. That's something that happens visually. Pitch might be a good example of auditory, maybe. Texture, haptic texture might be a good example of the haptic. And they're actually can interchange those ideas pretty well as well. Just when you change sense, you need to use a different attribute. Finally, we also use all our senses to pick up temporal sites of patterns. And so you have this, what I call temporal metaphors. So understanding patterns that relate to time, things like rhythms and rate are all kind of temporal metaphors. And again, I'm back to this guidelines, which again, because the field of information display is so large, even in 2000, but now it's even huger. I don't know if that's huge is the word, but there's lots of potential guidelines we can take from that. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. We can go back to these guidelines and what we know. So here is a picture of this multisensory design space. And as I said, it makes it very difficult if you divide by senses to try and compare and contrast when you're trying to make a decision about where do you map abstract data, which sensory attribute do you map it to. Whereas I think, for me at least, when I divide across these spatial, direct, and temporal metaphors, I'm able to transfer and discuss sensibly, what it means to compare objects, that, perhaps the scale of an object in space visually versus can we even compare the scale of an object in the auditory sense or the haptic sense. So for me, that's was a really powerful way to try and simplify and abstract this design space, which I'm interested in. Part of what one of the outcomes for me from the thesis was this what I call the MS taxonomy, which I can't even remember. It stands for multisensory taxonomy, or I think that's what it stands for. I assume so. It was 2000, so quite a few years ago. Was this model of the design space for multisensory information displays, and breaking this design space down into this different categorization. You have these spatial metaphors, you have these direct metaphors, and you have temporal metaphors, and then you can break it down and add in these sensory components, because it still makes sense to do that. It's just that each of the senses tends to have capabilities to understand different sorts of data. And I should say, of course, I think we all know that the eye is very good with spatial data. The ear is very good for temporal patterns, finding temporal patterns, and touch is somehow this integration of temporal and spatial data, which I guess we're still waiting on better displays to be able to leverage that. If you do this, you can end up, I describe the design space, break down the design space in this taxonomy sort of way. The nice thing about spatial visual metaphors is that you can just interswap the word visual with auditory, and you have the same structure, and same with haptic. You have the same structure. So even though it looks complex, it's actually a way to simplify the design space, for me at least anyway. When you come to the direct metaphors, these do start to show the direct the more sensory related capabilities. So things like color, such, and you can break how you talk about color, of course, it can be complicated as well, but what I call direct visual properties, direct auditory properties, and then you have this idea of structures, which we can do as well to overlay these properties. And I think I've clicked the button. You can just, oops, I think I went one too far. In terms of haptics, you can start thinking more about the haptics, unique capabilities of the haptic sense. And the haptics, I mean, to grasp, so that's, some people might call this tactile sense. There's some confusing over the naming of these things as well. In terms of temporal visual metaphors, this looks quite complicated again, but the nice thing is that for auditory and haptic metaphors, they all look the same. It's just, we can talk the same language in terms of the design. So that was my MS taxonomy, if you like, and one of the things I have. Oh, again, I'm going to have to move this. This is the problem of having a full screen map on Zoom. This temporal metaphors provide me a structure to categorize things. And I'll just go. The D's direct metaphor structure is nice. I think it helps me organize my thought space. And the same with this spatial meta. It helps me to organize an overarching map, in a different kind of map, I guess, of the design space. And I use this structure to help lay out my process, which I use in design of multisensory displays. And I've mentioned this guideline track a few times. And the other thing, of course, when you start bringing in this structure, you can start having guidelines that are specific to those different areas, you know, guidelines for spatial metaphors, for example, guidelines for temporal metaphors, and even using the structure itself to overarch the design process. And so the taxonomy, this is, you know, I'm big on taxonomies, and I don't know why I'm big on taxonomy. It seems to be a science thing, and maybe it's about breaking things down into smaller parts, which is something I would like to rebel against it sometimes, because I'd like to put everything back together again. And of course, the sum of the parts, the whole is different to the sum of the parts. But this idea of taxonomy really came from my early years doing software engineering. And I see some of the similar problems happening at the time. I don't know if these are still issues, but at the time there was issues around designing information displays. And I thought some of the lessons we'd learned from software engineering during the 80s and 90s, hard lessons, might be of use as well. So I picked up some ideas and from software engineering that kind of ran through the thesis. One of those was the modeling of abstract concepts. Now, of course, a lot of people maybe know that the ideas of object-oriented modeling come from the AI community, actually, and they originally kind of stemmed from trying to understand how people think about things. And so the ideas of UML diagrams, which involve two main types of structure. Things are made of parts, which is a component hierarchy, and things have a type, which is inheritance. Sometimes these are called is-a relationships and as-a relationship. Anyway, I found that those modeling things quite powerful, and that's why I reuse them. And in fact, I reuse them anytime I'm trying to understand a new field of knowledge. There's some abstraction, of course, and I can abstract these metaphors into a more structured way, thinking about inheritance and components, and they can build them together to build an architecture. In software engineering, it's nice to have an architecture or a framework which lets you stick things together. And so the MS taxonomy is a good example for me of an architecture that I can use for multisensory design display. Oops, I'm not sure what's happening here. These days, I guess we talk more about agile development, though that's more a philosophy than necessarily a process. But process was very important for software engineering, and I think it's very important for designing abstract data displays as well. And the two that I tended to rely on were things like prototyping and iterative models, some mixing together of that, because you really have uncertain requirements with information visualization, and you really want to build it to see what the outcome's like, because it's great to be conceptual, but when you build the things, sometimes they don't turn out the way you might expect. And that might be good, that might be bad. And so the other thing that was big in software engineering is the idea of a process. So I tried to define in my thesis a process which I could use for, or pretend to use it sometimes for designing displays. A lot of the ideas for this came out of TQM, total quality management. As I said, there's a lot of problems with software engineering in the 80s, so it was great. There's one way to sort of try and improve on that was to have a process and refine the process, evolve it, and measure performance at key parts of that process. And eventually, hopefully, you lead to a state where you can automate more. I think somewhat we've done that. I mean, I think sometimes the automation in information display is not what it should be. Maybe we just end up with a lot of pie charts and histograms in Excel, which is not necessarily the best thing. Anyway, one of the reasons I did have these guidelines as well is that guidelines are a great way to not lose knowledge, to try and build on the shoulders of giants, if that's the expression. And these guidelines can help as a checklist for evaluating displays. I mentioned the guidelines. I won't spend a lot of time on that. In the thesis, I gathered them from a range of sources, and I guess in my wildest dreams, I imagine I'd go on forever doing this. So to be honest, I've been working more in computer gaming than anything else in the last 15 years or so. But the guidelines came from perceptual science. They fed into the process of design. There was guidelines specifically organized around spatial, direct, and temporal designs of displays. Yeah, there was guidelines taken from the field of information display itself. There was guidelines from perception, and there was guidelines for using the MS taxonomy, guidelines for spatial, direct, and temporal metaphors. And finally, the idea that you could use these guidelines as some sort of formative checklist when you're evaluating the display at the end. Did you forget anything important? Just two more tracks to go. Hopefully I'm making okay with time and I'm not putting everyone to sleep. But here is the process which I described in my thing. And you see it runs through a lot of the same stations we've already visited. It was basically a design process that I tried to formulate for designing apps display. And the first thing I always did when I was building a display, and I still do, is try to understand the domain I'm working in. It's not unusual to find myself working in a domain which I have limited or no knowledge in. And it's really important, of course, that you understand more clearly not this grand idea of finding useful patterns, but what are the types of patterns that you're looking for? What's already known, and how do you sort of stretch beyond that? So you have to consider previous work. You have to consider what are the key attributes of a user's task. And task analysis is something that gets used a lot in user interface design. So I wanted to bring that into visualization, of course. Oops, now I'm having trouble with this. But anyway, yeah, so data characterization is another. And I think this is one area where people there's a bit of a shortfall in that people don't spend enough time trying to understand what type of data do you have? Is it objective? Is it subjective? What are the limits, the fuzziness in the data? What is the source of the data? Is some data have higher priority than other sorts of data? In stock market data, the price is number one, and other sorts of data, which may be derived from different things, is not so important. The volume of stocks traded is another. Okay, so there's some key sort of data priority areas that need to be recognized and will be different for different domains. So as I said, the process I went through was built around this taxonomy, and I don't know whether I was just trying to integrate that taxonomy overly, but I was just trying to give a more engineering type approach to the design. The first thing I would do when designing is think about different spatial metaphors I could use, still thinking that space is kind of a key determinant that you need to get right in terms of the data display, which is good because most of us do that anyway, I think. And then thinking about how we might overlap direct information to the attributes of the sense. And that's, I guess it's direct mapping to the sensory capabilities is kind of an easy thing to think about in a way. Harder are these temporal patterns, and that becomes a case if you have dynamic data or 4D data. It's something you do kind of naturally, but you might want to think about how your data evolves over time and how the spatial structures maybe evolve over time, or maybe how the information displaying on these different direct sensors, what happens when you start to try and display patterns or pick up patterns over time. Virtual environments, remember we went to that track. So I did a lot of prototyping as part of the process. And certainly as I did that, I had to consider a range of software things. At the time, it's relatively tricky to build virtual environments. Nowadays, there's a lot more powerful tools, I guess, but you certainly had to consider the software, and these hardware capabilities were very important. The speed of computers in 2000 were a lot less than they are today. So there were limitations you had to take into account. And I also like to think about different ways of evaluating the various visualization. The first step I always used was to get the experts back in and work with them. What do you think of this? I think it's great. What do you think? And they would tell me in no uncertain times it was nice or pretty or didn't do what they wanted or things were wrong. Or and I didn't want to do some more formal evaluation at that stage when I'm getting this kind of very short, hard feedback. And then if the experts were okay with what they thought the display should be doing, then I would use this checklist and just make sure I hadn't done anything silly, which is easy to do if you're not thinking about everything. And finally, if I got to the stage where I wanted to get more quantitative information about the value of the display, then I would move it as a last step to this kind of more formal, summative experimental, more like a psychology type experiment you might see. And it's an iterative process. Don't think you're going to come up with the perfect answer the first time. You might want to go through this a number of times. So sit on the train and go around the track a few times. The guidelines, the taxonomy, this process, well, what I thought of kind of some of the key outcomes, more conceptual outcomes from my thesis. Of course, there's a huge problem with this, isn't that how the hell do you evaluate scientifically the value of these types of things? So validating the outcomes is always a horrible thing lurking in my mind. Well, the way I did it was to at least apply it to a case study, and it was stock market display that I picked because I was really interested in, stock market data is interesting for lots of reasons. The people I worked with were intraday traders, very interested in finding trading rules, short-term trading rules in data. They had lots of data. This built on a field called technical analysis, which is somewhat in conflict with more economic fundamental analysis of stock market data. But the key tenet of technical analysis is that all the patterns are in the data itself. So all you need is the data to find useful trading patterns. Again, that can be controversial to some people, but and there's lots of different tasks. I think trying to identify viable trading strategies that could be used, automated for making money was a key interest of the stock market people I was working in. That's not surprising. We were mainly using depth of market data, which is really the bids and asks, what the buyers and sellers come in over time. I'll pay this much for this stock, and someone else, I'll sell this stock, so many of this stock for this much. So that's basically depth. So fairly simple data, really. And as I've already mentioned, price and volume seem to be the really key data attributes. In terms of the design, I went through this kind of design process 6 times altogether and came up with a number of different displays, all kind of focusing on 3D data displays of stock market data. One was this landscape of moving averages through the data, try and give a bigger picture of the changing fluctuations and remove some of the noise in the stock market data. And I also used a 3D bar chart, so simple, because why not try the simple thing first, hey? I did a lot of especially augmented some of these 3D displays with additional things like color and haptics to show extra attributes of the data. And then also some temporal metaphors. Particularly, we're interested, I guess, in the end, the most interesting display was about the dynamics of buyers and sellers and the waves between buyers and sellers, and how the changing interest in buying or selling might be driving the trade price. In fact, the early iterations of this display had the trade price down the middle, which is kind of this river where the buyers and sellers met. In the end, we decided to just get rid of the trades because they weren't really providing extra information. What was providing the information was the way the buyers and sellers moved apart and came together, and how maybe a big wave of buyers would push the price down. Big wave of buyers would push the price up. Sorry, a big wave of sellers from this side would push the price down. And it's those fluctuation in the dynamics which were of interest. These displays were all built on lots of different virtual environments, and I've mentioned these before. The Haptic Workbench down in CSO in Canberra, which was unique, this large screen display, Icon in Germany. So lots of different displays where we tried these things. So we went through a range of hardware platforms, a range of software. It was all very complicated. And in the end, I guess there were 6 main types of displays that we finalized and looked at. And we're not here to talk about stock market, so I won't talk too much. But again, I think the most interesting one was this, where am I? Sorry, it's just lagging a little bit there, was this bid-ask landscape, and this movement over time of these waves of buyers and sellers for a single stock. And we were able to experimentally show that people could, non-experts could predict the direction in which the trade price would move just by that information alone. Prove is a hard word, I guess. I mean, in the data that we use, and stock market data is quite difficult to prove things in, which makes it so interesting, of course. Yeah, so this was kind of a very much an auditory dynamic 3D stereographic display in a large immersive environment. And there were a range of case studies in the thesis: expert heuristic evaluation, formative, and also summative, more quantitative evaluation. Oh, that was quite a complicated thesis. I hope people have stayed with me, but you've now been over this entire map, and what looks like a complex grid of lines and stations, perhaps there's more context to it now and makes more sense. I should mention, Katie did mention there was a painting associated with this. I do a little of this, and so here is the painting just to have closure on that. You'll notice I'm very interested in context and framings, and obviously there's a lot of context and framing in my thesis. And with paintings, I'm always amazed that people still think that pictures should be square, rectangular. So this is a picture of the London Metro map being abstracted from 3D down to 2D. If people who are familiar with the London Metro map might recognize that these tracks are actually pretty close to what, at least in 2000, how the Metro map looked. Yeah, there are lots of, I think, there are lots of more papers which cover a lot of this area. A lot of these are quite old now. Originally, the Metro map was described in a conference paper in information visualization. When was it? 2004, so quite a while ago now, but it should still be available, still gets a few citations. And I think I was going to say that there's a book coming out soon, so hopefully, which is to deal more with my, I guess, other creative sides of looking at how painting and the science side of things, how some of the topics overlap. And information visualization is a good one because there's some really obvious links, I think, between things like the study of perception and the study of data and visual data science, for example, and a lot of things like that. So if people are interested, we can, down the track, hopefully, it was meant to be ready for Christmas, but not yet, not quite yet. Can you see that? It's probably a little dark. This is on the what was called the responsive workbench, which was at a place, GMD in St. Augustine near Bonn in Germany, where I did a lot of work with BHP, looking at originally petroleum type exploration data, and then went back there during my thesis to do some work with stock market data. So this is a landscape that's built using various moving averages through stock market data. And the reason they build these moving averages in stock market data is if you're trying to trade data, there can be a lot of fluctuations, and sometimes you want to smooth out those fluctuations. The problem is if you smooth out the fluctuations too much, you miss the opportunities for making sensible trade. So it's some compromise between what level of moving average you want to look at. So do you average the price over 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days a week? Maybe you have different types of moving. And this is often a trading strategy in stock market to intersect different moving averages. So I put them all together, and I excuse my dress at the time. It was a very hot summer, as I remember, in Germany. So the interaction is quite nifty. I mean, it really is like you are reaching out and working with an object in space. And this is part of that paradigm, of course, that virtual environments offers, just unique ways for interacting with data. And I haven't mentioned interaction, but of course, interaction with visualization are really key things. You want to be able to fiddle with your data, change parameters. It's that interaction process often which leads to the greatest insights for me anyway. So another great thing about a map, of course, is that it can help guide you down this path that you're wandering, and if you get lost, you can always come back with the map and find where you are. So here we're doing some things like zooming in on the data, and at the time shutter glasses seem to be quite common. That we see more polarized glasses these days, and again, you can see a little bit how clunky maybe the interaction really is. In 2000. And even to these days, it's still, you have to kind of put out of your mind, if you can, that you're actually got all this equipment, which is making you forget that you've got all this equipment. So this immersion relies on that you don't notice you're in a real surrounding, and sometimes equipment itself can prevent that. So that's an example of one of the displays, an early display of the stock market data. Actually, from this iteration, there were a number of changes made. We removed half the landscape because we really didn't need to reflect it, even though it made it nice symmetry in there. We also augmented it with both haptics and sound also, and allowed different color mappings, of course, under the data. So that is that. I'm almost out of time.
Yeah, I think we're good in timing. Thank you, Keith. I think we
No
can.
problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. And thank you very much, everyone, for being so patient with me. And hopefully you found this journey through my map, at least, interesting. Certainly, my supervisor, I can report, was very happy in the end that he understood a little bit better where the hell I was coming from, because otherwise he thought I was a bit weird, I think. No, Peter was always very supportive, and he actually liked the Metro map, of course, because it is his favorite thing, one of his favorite things.